My moniker Diamond Dave comes from when I would go over to the Van Halen side. That's like Ridgemont High.
David Lee Roth was once dubbed the Clown Prince of Rock and Roll, a man who wouldn't step on stage without a spin, a high kick, or a joke teetering on the edge of madness. But behind the spotlight, there's another version of Roth, quiet, conflicted, and fiercely unwilling to let anyone define him. He once worked as an EMT in New York, saving lives. He was arrested for buying marijuana in a park. He's had explosive arguments with bandmates, some nearly turning into fistfights. He's one of the greatest frontmen in rock history, but also the one fans and media have accused of destroying his own band. When Eddie Van Halen passed away, Roth didn't give a long statement or join any tribute tour, and that silence only fueled more controversy. Roth isn't an easy artist to love, but he's impossible to ignore. He's the kind of man who can infuriate you, then make you laugh, then somehow make you miss him. Because in a world that's growing increasingly bland, those who refuse to blend in always leave the deepest mark. At 70, after several retirements, David Lee Roth made a surprise return in 2025. No fanfare, no warning, just a short announcement in a packed venue. Just like how he showed up in life, not waiting for an invitation, but changing everything simply by being there. So what exactly forged a man this explosive yet solitary? And what keeps him standing between applause and criticism like a madman more lucid than the rest of us? If you've ever been pulled into that madness, even just once, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's not just support for us, but a tribute to an icon who never stayed quiet. Early life. Before he became the soul of Van Halen, before the scorching performances and that inimitable voice, David Lee Roth was just a boy with metal braces on his legs, a Jewish name in a school full of strangers, and an inner world always on the verge of explosion. Born on October 10th, 1954, in Bloomington, Indiana, Roth grew up in a middle-class family. His father, Nathan Roth, was an ENT surgeon who had served in the military and studied medicine through the GI Bill. His mother, Sybil Roth, was a former teacher and amateur actress. Though considered an educated household, things at home were far from peaceful. When Roth was in middle school, his mother suffered a serious horseback riding accident and was hospitalized for nearly a year. The trauma not only altered her personality, but also created a tense, unstable atmosphere at home, a time Roth would later describe as a haunting, emotional, deep freeze. From an early age, Roth was seen as different. He wore leg braces due to skeletal issues, which made him an easy target for bullying. When the family relocated to Pasadena, California, the sense of isolation didn't go away. It deepened. He was now the new Jewish kid, with a strange name and an even stranger attitude. It was within that alienation that Roth began to build a private world of his own, a place where he could be anyone, say anything, and never have to ask permission to be himself. When his boundless energy became too much, his parents sent him to a horse riding camp for troubled teens, not as punishment, but to instill discipline and personal responsibility. There, he learned to respect silence, work with animals, and grow familiar with the feeling of being removed from the rest of the world. Later, he would call it the beginning of the mask-making phase, when a lonely child learned to turn weirdness into a survival weapon. Even as a kid, Roth radiated uncontrollable energy. He learned to play guitar, devoured biographies of Lenny Bruce and Muhammad Ali, watched hundreds of variety shows, and fell in love with the small stages where performers ruled without boundaries. While his peers dreamed of becoming doctors or engineers, Roth thought only of the spotlight, not for attention, but to escape the suffocating shell of a life always labeled as odd. And it was from those experiences, isolation, illness, chaos, and the struggle to gain control, that a one-of-a-kind performer was born. Not out of a desire for fame, but from a need to survive. Not to be loved, but to avoid being swallowed by the world. David Lee Roth was never a normal child, and that, more than anything, is what saved him. Early career. For David Lee Roth, music didn't start with melody. It started with instinct, with a raspy laugh, an impromptu jump, the sheer thrill of being seen, being heard, being remembered. He didn't enter rock as a musician, but as a born performer finally finding his stage. In high school in Pasadena, Roth wasn't a top student, but he was the center of attention in any room with a crowd. He attended Pasadena City College, the place where fate intervened, and Roth met brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen. At the time, the two were playing in a band called Mammoth, but they lacked a truly charismatic frontman. Roth was then performing with a group called Red Ball Jets, not known for musical precision, but for his wild, unhinged stage persona. At first, the Van Halen brothers didn't think much of Roth's voice. In fact, they initially hired him as a part-time vocalist, mostly because he owned his own PA system. But his bizarre presence, raw energy, and utterly unique performance style soon changed their minds. By 1974, Roth officially joined Mammoth, and the band changed its name to Van Halen, a name that would later become legend. The four members, Eddie Van Halen, Alex Van Halen, Michael Anthony, and David Lee Roth, began playing bars across Pasadena, Huntington Beach, and Hollywood. Every night was a battle for survival. No dressing rooms, no big contracts, just manic guitar riffs, non-stop movement, and crowds that often hadn't come for the music. As the frontman, Roth quickly became the focal point. He didn't just sing, he screamed, jumped, flipped, flirted with the audience through cocky grins and provocative jokes. Eddie was the guitar genius, but Roth was the force that made Van Halen impossible to look away from. Their turning point came when Kiss bassist Gene Simmons saw them perform and financed their first demo. Though Simmons wasn't able to land them a record deal, that demo led them to Warner Brothers. In 1977, Van Halen signed with the label, and a year later, their debut album, Van Halen, was released. That marked the end of their dive bar days and the beginning of something monumental. No longer just a flamboyant singer with a mediocre voice, David Lee Roth had officially become one of the premier frontmen of his era, not because of vocal perfection, but because of his ability to turn every moment on stage into a legend. In a rock world obsessed with technique, he chose chaos. In an age of polish and precision, he chose to be deliberately unruly. And that, more than anything, is what made him and Van Halen irreplaceable. Career breakthrough. They used to say, Eddie Van Halen was the brain, but David Lee Roth was the heart, wild, erratic, and impossible to contain. If Eddie left you in awe with his lightning-fast tapping, Roth made you laugh, then blush, then want to jump on your seat and scream along. He wasn't just a singer. He was the scorching wind that set Van Halen ablaze. When Van Halen's debut album dropped in 1978, the rock world was growing tired, weary of serious faces, endless ballads, and tight, gloomy suits. Then came Roth, in leather pants, leaping like a martial artist, grinning like a madman, singing like he was about to fall off a cliff. And the crowd loved him. because no one else was like him. Van Halen quickly became a seismic force. Even before the hit Jump, tracks like Runnin' With the Devil and Ain't Talkin' About Love told you something dangerously electric was happening. Roth turned every stage into a battlefield. He mocked the audience, argued with security, slid across the stage on his knees, and the next morning, every newspaper had his name on it. From 1978 to 1984, Van Halen didn't slow down. They released a string of albums that rocked the entire industry. But Roth didn't measure success in awards or charts. For him, it was when a fan climbed over a barricade just to hug him, when a stadium erupted in laughter at a throwaway joke, when Eddie turned mid-set, sweat pouring down, and laughed, "You're insane, man!" The pinnacle came in 1984. With Jump, Roth did what no one thought a hard rock band would dare. He turned the keyboard into a weapon. In the music video, he didn't stand still for a second, jumping like a maniac, smiling like a runaway lunatic. Yet every move was intentional. It wasn't just rock anymore. It was performance art. But behind every explosive show were quiet nights in the studio where Roth and Eddie were speaking less and less of the same language. Eddie wanted depth. Roth wanted breadth. Eddie wanted music to touch the soul. Roth wanted it to hit you in the gut and make you scream. They didn't hate each other. They just stopped being a band and became two colliding worlds. In 1985, just as they were peaking, Roth walked away. No press conference, no farewell tour. Just a decision that stunned millions. And for many, it wasn't just the day Roth left, it was the day Van Halen lost its soul. Sure, Van Halen would go on. They still sold records, still had hits. But that raw, dangerous magic that once made them so thrilling, so untouchable, it left with the high-kicking jester. Because David Lee Roth wasn't just part of Van Halen. He was the reason people remembered them, with every scream, every bit of chaos, and that smile no one else could ever imitate. Solo career. When David Lee Roth left Van Halen in 1985, many saw it as a foolish move, walking away from a band at the peak of its global dominance. But Roth was never one to enjoy the mountaintop unless he was the one standing at its center. To him, success meant nothing if it was under someone else's control. So the jester went solo, taking with him all the chaos, swagger, and instinct for performance to write his own next chapter. He didn't waste time. That same year, he released The Crazy from the Heat EP, featuring covers like California Girls and Just a Gigolo, I Ain't Got Nobody. It wasn't rock, it was swing, lounge, parody, a playful jab at the very industry that had built him. The music videos were loud, garish, hilarious, and unapologetically David Lee Roth. It was his way of declaring, "I'm not leaving, I'm flying, and I'll fly in my own direction." In 1986, Roth dropped his first full solo studio album, Eat M and Smile. This time, he wasn't joking. He assembled a super band, Steve Vai on guitar, Billy Sheehan on bass, Greg Bissonette on drums. The album hit hard, heavy riffs, blazing energy, and vocals still full of fire, with videos just as bizarre as ever. It went platinum, proving Roth didn't need Van Halen to shine. Skyscraper, 1988, followed, continuing his commercial success. Its single, Just Like Paradise, broke into the Billboard Top 10, but behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Creative tensions led to Sheehan's departure. Steve Vai left after the next album, A Little Ain't Enough, 1991. As grunge rose, Favoring rawness over high kicks and tight leather, Roth began to lose his footing. The 1990s were difficult years. Albums like Your Filthy Little Mouth, 1994, and DLR Band, 1998, failed to make an impact. In 1996, Roth briefly reunited with Van Halen to record a few new tracks, but tensions erupted once again. The reunion collapsed in bitterness, even playing out awkwardly on MTV. But what set Roth apart wasn't how he fell. It was how he got up and did something no one expected. In 2000, nearing 50, David Lee Roth became a certified emergency medical technician, EMT, in New York City. He worked over 200 shifts, kept his identity quiet, no cameras, no press. "I wanted to do something that actually helped someone survive," he said, later. No one imagined a legendary frontman would choose saving lives over recording albums. But for Roth, that kind of illogical detour was the very definition of freedom. Then in 2007, the unthinkable happened. David Lee Roth returned to Van Halen, this time with Eddie's son, Wolfgang, on bass, replacing Michael Anthony. The tour was a massive sellout. The album, A Different Kind of Truth, 2012, received critical praise. The relationships within the band remained complicated, but for a brief moment, the old magic returned. While Roth never replicated the explosive success of his early years, his solo career stands as proof of one thing: he never needed someone else to chart his path. Uneven, full of missteps and questionable decisions, it was still his road. And at every twist and turn, you could hear that wild, defiant laugh echo. And no, David Lee Roth had never truly disappeared. Controversies, scandals, rumors. When you live like a cartoon character, people will believe any crazy thing they hear about you, even if it's not true. David Lee Roth. Throughout his career, David Lee Roth has always challenged the very definition of scandal. He never shied away from chaos, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply because that's how he survived. But behind the mic stand twirls, the outrageous Roth-isms, and the unpredictable solos lies a string of quiet incidents. Rumors that spread faster than guitar riffs, and shadows he rarely speaks of. One of the most famous legends tied to Roth is the brown M&M. In his notoriously detailed backstage rider, there was one line: "No brown M&Ms in the candy bowl." The media mocked it as a diva demand, but in truth, it was a contract test trap. If brown M&Ms were found, Roth knew the promoter hadn't read the rider carefully and may have missed technical details that could endanger the band. On the surface, a joke. Underneath, a serious lesson in safety and professionalism. That's Roth. Controversial, but rarely meaningless. But not all rumors were harmless. In 1993, Roth was arrested in Washington Square Park for buying marijuana from an undercover cop, a $10 transaction. He wasn't criminally charged, only issued a citation, but the press didn't miss the chance to sensationalize it. To them, it was David Lee Roth, fallen rock legend. To Roth, it was like a parking ticket. Don't canonize me, but don't demonize me over a joint either. In 2006, Roth tried his hand at radio, taking over Howard Stern's slot on CBS Radio. It was a risky move. The David Lee Roth show was quickly panned by critics. Unlistenable, chaotic, like turning on music and letting a drunk guy ramble. 6 months later, it was canceled. Roth sued, not for money, but for dignity. Once again, his defiance didn't fit the market mold. And so, he returned to the stage, the only place he could be fully himself without needing permission. Around that time, Roth revealed a little-known chapter. For nearly 30 years, he had been stalked. A mysterious man would call him nightly, send threatening letters, and even show up at his home. Roth described it as low-level personal terrorism, but so prolonged it scrambled my entire mental world. No headlines, no cameras, just an invisible scar carried beneath the laughter and swagger. Then came the unconfirmed rumors that Roth blocked a different kind of truth from being released on digital platforms, or that he refused to join the Eddie Van Halen tribute tour because he didn't want to be a sideshow act. Wolfgang Van Halen once referred to Roth as this F-ing kid, as if Roth would always be the rebel child in a family that never quite fit together. Roth didn't respond. He stayed silent, perhaps the strangest response he's ever given. David Lee Roth once said, "People think I'm crazy, but I'm actually more lucid than they realize." Maybe that's why he never spiraled into hard drugs, never got caught in messy affairs, never went bankrupt. But maybe that same lucidity, that control over his wild man image, is why few ever saw the loneliness, the quiet battles he fought behind the curtain. In the end, perhaps the greatest scandal of Roth's life is that no one ever truly understood him. Personal life. David Lee Roth once stood before tens of thousands, screaming into the microphone with eyes ablaze, as if ready to burn the world down. But when the lights went out and the backstage doors closed, what lingered wasn't the roar of the crowd. It was silence. A silence Roth chose and has fiercely preserved throughout his life. He has never been married. No children, no messy divorces, no whirlwind romances with starlets plastered across tabloids. Roth rarely appeared publicly with girlfriends and almost never spoke of his private life. When asked, he often dodged with a joke or a cryptic philosophy. "I never got married because I'd rather be loved than owned." For a man who's always lived on the edge of every norm, perhaps marriage felt more like a boundary than a sanctuary. Yet Roth was never a recluse. On the contrary, he has always been one of the most curious and open individuals when it comes to life itself. He studied martial arts from a young age, earned a black belt in Kenpo karate, trained in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and has maintained a strict fitness regimen well into his 60s. He paints, writes poetry, tells stories, designs stage costumes, and even taught himself emergency medicine. To Roth, every new skill was a form of rebirth, not for the stage, but for self-mastery. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of his personal life was becoming an emergency medical technician, EMT, in New York City. In the mid-2000s, while his contemporaries relaxed on royalties or joined reunion tours, Roth quietly enrolled in EMT training and went on to work hundreds of emergency calls, completely under the radar. No one realized that the former Van Halen frontman was performing CPR on accident victims in the middle of Manhattan. When the press eventually caught wind of it, he just smiled. Doing something that actually helps someone survive, no stage, just doing it right. That's stronger than any applause I've ever heard. Outside of EMT work, Roth poured his energy into eccentric and deeply personal projects. He created the Roth Project, a hybrid graphic novel blending music and comic art, all written, illustrated, and narrated by him. He spent extended time in Japan, studying Shinto philosophy and traditional tattooing. He's never been afraid of solitude, never feared aging, and remains perfectly content with a life that doesn't need validation from anyone. In a rare interview, Roth once said, "I'm not lonely. I'm just extremely selective about who gets access to my world." That may be the clearest answer to why a man who seemingly had it all, fame, fortune, looks, talent, chose a life lived almost invisibly outside the spotlight. Because for David Lee Roth, freedom was never about doing everything. It was about choosing what to keep and what to let go, even if that meant love, family, or the image of being a star. He never needed someone else to complete him, because he never saw himself as incomplete. And that perhaps is why, even living alone, he's never truly been lonely. Legacy and influence. David Lee Roth isn't the kind of artist you build a statue of in front of a museum. He doesn't wear medals, doesn't collect Grammys, and he's never topped a list of most influential people of the century. But if you've ever heard a rock voice dripping with swagger, watched a frontman flip across a stage, or seen a performer turn absurdity into greatness, then you've witnessed Roth's legacy, even if you didn't call it by name. As the lead vocalist of Van Halen from 1978 to 1984, Roth helped redefine American rock. He didn't have the widest vocal range, and he wasn't classically trained, but he was one of the rare few who made it impossible to look away. The flips, the high kicks, the ninja-style mic twirls, the witty, double-edged banter, he didn't just sing the song. He lived inside it. Roth transformed the frontman into an art form of its own. Names that followed, Axl Rose, Sebastian Bach, even Brandon Flowers of the Killers, all carry traces of Roth. The boldness, the recklessness, the unteachable charisma. And in pop culture, David Lee Roth long ago became more than a name. It became an adjective. That guy's totally Roth means wild, funny, and completely unconcerned with what anyone thinks. But Roth's influence goes beyond the stage. The infamous "no brown M&Ms" clause is now a classic case study in the event production world, a clever tactic to test a promoter's attention to detail. Today, business and leadership schools still teach that story as a lesson in risk management, an unexpected legacy from a shirtless, big-haired rocker. Culturally, Roth and Van Halen helped usher in the MTV era, when music became as much about image, style, and performance as it was about sound. Music videos, like Jump, Hot for Teacher, and Panama, didn't just sell millions of records, they laid the foundation for the idea that an artist had to be a performer, not just a singer. Today, in an industry increasingly standardized, where artists fear being wrong or being weird, the shadow of David Lee Roth looms larger than ever. Not as a frozen monument, but as a recurring aftershock. Dare to be different. Dare to be outrageous. And if you're brave enough, make the world turn around just to hear you laugh. Current life. David Lee Roth was once the center of every stage, where the lights blazed the brightest, where applause roared loudest, where madness and charisma blended without a script. But at 70, he's chosen to live outside that spotlight, quietly, strangely, and entirely by choice. In 2021, after Eddie Van Halen's passing, Roth announced his retirement. No tears, no grand farewell tour, just a brief statement. "I've given you all I've got." And then he vanished. No flashy social media, no talk shows revisiting the glory days. Only a few rare glimpses. David Lee Roth, with a long beard and silver hair, standing by a canvas, or crossing the street like any old man in Las Vegas. The only thing he left behind was the Roth Project, a hybrid graphic novel and audio-visual experience where he told a story of soul, desire, death, and freedom. Not through screams, but in a whisper. It wasn't made to sell. It felt more like a message. I'm still here, but I've chosen to speak differently now. Recently, however, he surprised everyone by announcing a performance at the Duquoin State Fair in Illinois, scheduled for August 2025, marking his first time on stage in 5 years. No one knows why he's coming back. No one's sure if it's the start of a tour or just a one-off. But with Roth, every surprise has its reason. And perhaps the stage is still the only place where he truly feels alive. The Roth flame doesn't blaze like it used to, but it's never gone out. It smolders in a quiet room, waiting for the right moment to ignite once more. Not for glory, not for nostalgia, but simply because David Lee Roth is still David Lee Roth. And the world has never really been ready for him. David Lee Roth was never a perfect icon. He stirred controversy, was seen as a troublemaker, walked away from Van Halen at their peak, and returned as if nothing had ever happened. But through it all, he never pretended to be anyone else. That's what made him different, and immortal in his own unruly way. He was too loud to be called a graceful legend, too rebellious to be a national treasure, and too irrational to be measured by any conventional standard. But that's exactly why people remember him. In a world full of polished faces and carefully manufactured products, Roth was the unprogrammable accident, chaos with a purpose. He doesn't need statues, honorary titles, or romantic retrospectives. Just one person, somewhere, hitting play on Jump and smiling. Just one young singer daring to leap off the stage instead of hitting the perfect note. Just one mention of his name. And Roth still lives on. If this story made you smile, surprised you, or simply reminded you of a time when music didn't know fear, hit like and subscribe. It's how we keep alive the untamed spirits, like David Lee Roth,